Ah! 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 I must overwrite copyrighted music. Oh wow, I'm starting to like that song. Hello, Richard. I've been so unproductive. But it don't matter, because it's time for, I'm assuming, chapter 14. I'm trusting you, Richard, because you said it was chapter 14 time. Sorry for any ears that were broken. No, why? It's time for chapter 14. There's supposed to be no one watching this. Chapter 14. As the earliest suspicion of dawn appeared on Sunday morning, Huck rapped gently at the old Welshman's door. The inmates were asleep, but it was a sleep that was set on a hair trigger. A call came from a window. Who's there? Huck's scared voice answered. It's only Huck Finn. It's a name that can open this door, night or day, lad. And welcome. There were these strange words to the vagabond boy's ears. He could not recollect that the closing word had ever been applied to his case before. The door was unlocked, and he entered. He was given a seat, and the old man and his tall sons dressed speedily. Now, my boy, I hope you're good and hungry, because breakfast will be ready soon. I and the boys hoped you'd stop here last night. I was awful scared, said Huck. I took out when the pistols went off, and I didn't stop for 3 miles. I come now because I want to know about it. And I come before daylight because I don't want to run across the devils, even if they was dead. You do look as if you've had a hard night. There'll be a bed here for you when you've had your breakfast. No, they ain't dead, lad. We're sorry for that. We crept along on tiptoe till we got within 15 feet of them, dark as a cellar that Sumac path was. And just before I found I was going to sneeze, I tried to keep it back, but no use. The sneeze started. The scoundrels are rustling, so I sang out, "Fire, boys!" and blazed away at the place where the rustling was. So did the boys. But they were off in a jiffy, those villains, and we after them, down through the woods. I judge we never touched them. They fired a shot apiece as they started, but their bullets whizzed by us. As soon as we lost the sound of their feet, we went and stirred up the constables. They got a posse together and went off to guard the riverbank. And as soon as it light, the sheriff and a gang are going to beat up the woods. My boys will be with them presently. I wish we had some sort of description of those rascals. I wish we had some sort of description of those rascals. But you couldn't see what they were like in the dark, lad, I suppose. Oh, yes, I saw them downtown and followed them. One's the old deaf and dumb Spaniard that's been around here once or twice, and t'other's a mean looking, ragged. That's enough, lad. We know the men. Happened on them in the woods one day, and they slunk away. Boys, tell the sheriff. Get your breakfast tomorrow morning. The Welshman's sons departed at once. As they were leaving, Huck exclaimed, "Oh, please, don't tell anyone it was me that blowed on them. Oh, please." "All right, if you say it, Huck, but you ought to have the credit of what you did." When the young men were gone, the old Welshman said, "They won't tell, and I won't. But how did you come to follow these fellows, lad? Were they looking suspicious?" Huck was silent while he framed a duly cautious reply. Then he said, "Well, you see, I'm a kind of hot lot. Least everyone says so. And sometimes I can't sleep much on account of thinking about it and sort of trying to strike out a new way of doing. That was a way. That was a way of it last night. I couldn't sleep, and I come along up street about midnight, a turning it all over. And just when I got to that old brick store by the Temperance Tavern, along comes these two chaps, slipping along close by me. They had something, and I followed them. I wanted to see what was up. They sneaked along. I dogged them to the put her. I dogged them to the widow's. I dogged them to the widow's stile and stood in the dark and heard the ragged one beg for the widow. And the Spaniard swear he'd spile her looks, just as I told you, and you're too. What? The deaf and dumb man said all that. Huck made a terrible mistake. He was trying his best to keep the old man from getting the faintest hint of who the Spaniard might be, and yet his tongue seemed determined to get him into trouble. He made several efforts to creep out of his scrape, but the old man's eye was upon him, and he made blunder after blunder. Presently, the Welshman said, "My boy, don't be afraid of me. I wouldn't hurt a hair on your head for all the world. You know something about the Spaniard that you want to keep dark. Now tell me what it is, and trust me, I won't betray you." Huck looked at the old man's honest eyes for a moment, then bent over and whispered, "Tain't a Spaniard. It's Injun Joe." The Welshman almost jumped out of his chair. The moment he said, "It's all plain enough now. When you talked about notching ears and slitting noses, I judged that was your own embellishment, because white men don't take that sort of revenge. But an Injun, that's a different matter altogether." During the breakfast, the talk went on, and in the course of it, the old man said that the last thing which he and his sons had done before going to bed was to get a lantern and examine the stile and its vicinity for blood marks. They found none, but captured an old bulky bundle of what? If the words had been lightning, they could not have leapt a more stunning suddenness from Huck's blanched lips. His eyes were staring wide now, his breath suspended, waiting for the answer. The Welshman started, stared in return, and then replied, "Of burglar's tools." "Why, what's the matter with you?" Huck sank back down, unutterably grateful. The Welshman eyed him curiously. "It appears to relieve you a good deal. What were you expecting to be found? What were you expecting would found?" Huck was in a close place. The inquiring eye was upon him, and a senseless reply offered. At a venture, he uttered it. "Sunday school books, maybe." The old man laughed loud and joyously, and ended by saying that such a laugh was money in a man's pocket, because it cut down the doctor's bills. And he added, "Poor old chap, you're white and jaded, you ain't well. No wonder you're a little flighty. But rest and sleep will fetch you all right, I hope." Huck was irritated to think he had betrayed such a suspicious excitement, for before this he had all but dropped the idea that the parcel brought from the tavern was the treasure. But on the whole, he felt glad that the little episode had happened, for now he knew beyond all question that the bundle was not the bundle, and so his mind was at rest. The treasure must be still in number two. The men would be captured and jailed that day, and he and Tom could seize the gold that night without any fear of interruption. And just as breakfast was completed, there was a knock on the door. Huck jumped for a hiding place, for he had no mind to be connected even remotely with the event. The Welshman had admitted several ladies and gentlemen, among them the widow Douglas, and noticed the groups of citizens were climbing up the hill to stare at the stile. So the news had spread. The Welshman had to tell the story of the night to their visitors. He told all, save Huck's role in the affair. The widow's gratitude for her preservation was outspoken. I went to speak. I went to sleep reading in bed and slept straight through through all the noise. She said, "Why don't you come and wake me? We judged it weren't worthwhile. Those fellows weren't likely to come again. And what was the use of waking you up and scaring you to death?" My three Negro men stood guard at your house the rest of the night. They've just come back. More visitors came back. More visitors came, and the story had to be told and retold for a couple of hours. There's no Sabbath school during there's no Sabbath school during day school vacation, but everyone was nine of the two villains had been yet discovered. When the sermon was finished, Judge Thatcher's wife dropped alongside of Mrs. Harper as she moved down the aisle with the crowd and said, "Is my Becky going to sleep all day? I've just expected she would be tired to death." "Your Becky?" "Yes," with a startled look. "Didn't she say stay with you last night?" "Why, no." Mrs. Thatcher turned pale and sank into a pew just as Aunt Polly passed by. Aunt Polly said, "Good morning, Mrs. Thatcher, Mrs. Harper. I've got a boy that's turned up missing. I reckon my Tom's stayed at your house last night, one of you. And now he's afraid to come to church. I've got to settle with him." Mrs. Thatcher shook her head and turned paler than ever. "He didn't stay with us," Mrs. Harper, beginning to look uneasy. A marked anxiety came into Aunt Polly's face. "Joe Harper, have you seen my Tom this morning?" "No." "No, like not me? I don't know." "When did you see him last?" Joe tried to remember, but was not sure he could say. People had stopped moving out of church, and uneasiness took possession of every countenance. Children were anxiously questioned, and young teachers. They all said that they had not noticed whether Tom and Becky were on board the ferry boat on the homeward trip. It was dark. No one thought of inquiring if anyone was missing. One young man finally blurted out his fear that they were still in the cave. Mrs. Thatcher swooned away. Aunt Polly fell to crying and wringing her hands. The alarm swept from lip to lip, from group to group, and within 5 minutes the bells were wildly clanging and the whole town was up. The widow's burglars were forgotten. Horses were saddled, and the ferry boat ordered out. And before the horror was half an hour, the old oh, before the horror was half an hour old, 200 men were pouring down high road and river toward the cave. All the long afternoon, the village seemed empty and dead. Many women visited Aunt Polly and Mrs. Thatcher and tried to comfort them. All the tedious night, the town waited for news. But when morning dawned at last, all the word that came was All the word that came was, send more candles and send food. Judge Thatcher sent hopeful messages from the cave, but they conveyed no real cheer. The old Welshman came home toward daylight, spattered with candle grease and worn out. He found Huck still in the bed that he had provided for him, and delirious with fever. The physicians were all at the cave, so the widow Douglas came and took charge of the patient. Mr. Jones and Huck said Huck had good spots in him, and the widow said you can depend on them. The That's the Lord's mark. He puts it somewhere on every creature that comes from his hands. I can't read. Early in the forenoon, parties of jaded men began straggling into the village, but the strongest of the citizens continued searching. All the news that could be gained was that remotelessness of the cavern were being ransacked. Sorry, 2 seconds. My eye. Uh, uh. Early in the forenoon, parties of jaded men began straggling into the village, but the strongest of the citizens continued searching. All the news that had all the news that could be gained was that remotelessness of the cavern were being ransacked that had never been visited before. That wherever one wandered through the maze of passages, lights were to be seen flitting hither and thither in the distance, and shoutings and pistol shots sent their hollow reverberations down the somber aisles. In one place, far from the section usually traversed by tourists, the names Becky and Tom had been found traced upon the rock wall in with candle smoke, and near the hand a grease-soiled bit of ribbon. Mrs. Thatcher recognized the ribbon and cried over it. 3 dreadful days and nights dragged their tedious hours along, and the village sank into a hopeless stupor. No one had a heart for anything. The tremendous discovery just made that the proprietor of the Temperance Tavern kept liquor on his premises scarcely fluttered the public pulse. In a lucid interval, Huck feebly led up to the subject of taverns and asked, dimly dreading the worst, if anything had been discovered at the Temperance Tavern. Yes, said the widow. Huck started up in the bed, wide-eyed. What? What was it? Liquor. And the place had been shut up. Lie down, child. What a turn you did give me. Only tell me just one thing. Just one, please. Was it Tom Sawyer that found it? The widow burst into tears. Hush, child, hush. I told you before. You must not talk. You must not talk. You are very, very sick. Then nothing but liquor had been found. There would be, there would have had, there would have been a great powwow if it had been the gold. So the treasure was gone forever. Gone forever. But what could she be crying about? These thoughts worked their dim way through Huck's mind, and under the weariness they gave him, he fell asleep. The widow said to herself, there, he's asleep, poor wreck. Tom Sawyer find it. Pity, but somebody's could find Tom Sawyer. There ain't many left now. That's got hope enough, or strength enough either, to go on searching. End of chapter 14. Tune in next time for chapter 15. Also, who's watching? So Richard's one person. Who's the second person? But you're watching, I guess. I don't know. Still feels weird having people watch. And this is the first time I've had people comment. So thanks, Rich. Okay, bye-bye.